everyone to this BMF Young Professionals webinar. It is now 10 past 5. We were supposed to be going at 5 o'clock. I would like to apologize for that. What we do is we set up a time between 4:30 and 5 for troubleshooting, because we are now learning that increasingly we're going to be faced with some of these challenges to get our sessions going. And I must just apologize. In the write-up, there was an error. So a lot of people assumed that the session begins at 4:30. The session begins at 5 o'clock, and it is exactly because of finding ways to anticipate some of the challenges that we might face. And some people are still saying that they're having challenges connecting. So we will find that they will find us along the way as the conversation begins. So why are we here? I'm the provincial chairperson of the BMF Young Professionals in the Eastern Cape. And part of the reason why these sessions have begun is to really ignite a conversation amongst young people. That conversation, on one hand, is rooted in a discussion about the draft national youth policy on one hand, because the draft national youth policy had called for comments in the public domain. And while that was going on, Corona hit, and the state of disaster was declared, and we were all on lockdown. But interestingly enough, I was reading in a paper earlier that I think the Treasurer General of the ruling party was speaking recently, and he said young people must now take the lead to rebuild the economy post-COVID. Now, this is very interesting, because the modeling of these conversations is actually in the spirit of that, in the spirit of how young people can start to organize themselves to be part of growing that conversation, of coming up with a framework for how they're going to lead the next paradigm. So what we then did was we thought, well, let's try and gather together some of our most dynamic minds. So we began the session about 2 weeks ago, and we had here the CEO of the NYDA. We had, if I remember correctly, Mandlikazi Mazule, who's a business, an MBA graduate from Oxford University. She's also South African, but she's based in the UK, and a couple of others. And what's also critical.
Papama,
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but everyone in the room is asking what's the status, so you're not broadcasting.
Khulukazi, can you hear that?
We are indeed on air. We're live.
So that means everyone's is in the wrong room then.
You may redirect them using the link you sent, Papama. I'm not sure which room they are in.
Hassan, can I ask you to send the last link I
sent? The last link you sent to me.
As well.
Say again?
I will try access the previous room as well.
All right, I'm back in the last room, and it's showing that you are live, but I have to share that link again to the other guys. So, okay, it's working.
It seems we have lost Pap, or he's rejoined.
Okay, I seem to have been cut. I'm back now, and the numbers are sitting at 13. Can I get an indication from you, Hassan, that everyone you are seeing is now here?
Yeah, so the link is working, and I'm trying to send it out to each of them.
So the link is working.
But you can just continue.
Yeah, the numbers have grown to about
Yes.
13. They're still growing, so it means the link is starting to work. I think
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Ukulugazi. Okay, maybe I'll type it into the chat box. My apology once Wela gets going with her talk. I will type out my apology that is explaining what is the story with all these glitches that we are experiencing, and rehash my apology of explaining why we wanted to have people starting to log in from about 4:30, so that we can anticipate some of these challenges here. So maybe I should just continue from this point of view that then says the objective of this conversation is to model a conversation that young people in South Africa should start to have, and to ensure that that conversation contextualizes itself in a global environment, and starts to sort of locate where South Africans exist within a global conversation that young people are having. So this conversation is really about young people in South Africa conversing with young people in the diaspora about what it means to be young today, and specifically in a post-COVID world and towards the fourth industrial revolution. So as I said before, Paul Mashatile has made this call, which makes sense, that young people should take charge of their futures. But for us, then the critical thing is we engage with the state from our legislative framework through a set of institutions and legislation. And one of the things that we have, the levers that we have in terms of engagement with the state as young people, is the National Youth Policy Draft of 2020-2030. So these engagements that we are having here are part of an ongoing series of engagements with different professionals and different young people to give us different views and perspectives on how to look at the young people's condition, and then in turn inform the process of writing the draft national youth policy. So I don't want to waste time now, because we've lost sufficient time from the glitches that we've experienced in starting up. I will introduce the speakers as we go along. The first speaker who's going to talk to us is Ms. Wela Mlokoti. Wela is a young professional from the legal background. She's been living in Johannesburg for quite some time now. She's an LLB from UCT and an LLM from Duke University. And she clerked for the Constitutional Court under Justice Jafta, and completed her articles with ENS Africa. And basically, we thought that at this time, in a post-COVID time, and after some of the announcements that had been made to some of the legislations that are changing, some of the regulation that is being published on a daily basis in terms of how the state interfaces with us as the public, we thought it would be good to have a legal mind in the room to kind of help us make sense of where we are as young people today and in a post-COVID world and going forward. So, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hello?
You are audible. Go right ahead.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Papama. I'll get started right away. So, hi everyone. As Papama said, I'm here to take you through some of the constitutional legal issues at play in South Africa, particularly as they relate to the lockdown. I think it's really important for us to have a strong grasp of that for ourselves as young citizens, particularly during a pandemic, which is a time of extreme stress and panic, where it can be really easy to find ourselves deferring completely to the government and public officials, when actually it's the most critical time to be vigilant in holding public officials accountable and responsible for all of their actions. We know that with internet penetration being what it is, many South Africans are quite clued up on major developments on the law. One need only log on to any social media platform to see, for example, the various forms of discourse that took place around judgments such as the corporal punishment judgment, the judgment on the status of the public protector's report, and so on. And so we find ourselves here. We're on what we've been told is level 4 of a nationwide lockdown, and regulations are being passed regularly that appear to be changing the contours of our rights on what seems to be a daily basis. So let me start from the beginning. On the 15th of March this year, the president declared a state of disaster in terms of the Disaster Management Act in order to introduce measures to combat the spread of the coronavirus in SA. The Disaster Management Act facilitates coordination, mitigation, and recovery following a disaster, whether natural or man-made. Section 27 of the Act gives the government extensive powers to deal with the crisis, and cabinet ministers may use existing legislation in order to do so. It's important to understand that a state of disaster is not to be confused with a state of emergency. In a state of disaster, the government is still fully obligated to respect the rights contained in the Bill of Rights, such as the right to privacy, the right to freedom of movement, freedom of association, etc. Any measures taken under a state of disaster can be tested against the rights in the Bill of Rights and declared unconstitutional in a court of law if they are if they're found to be overbroad or disproportionate to the harm that they're sought to avoid or cure. Now, declaring a state of emergency is a far more radical step because it allows the government to derogate from most of the rights that are contained in the Constitution. While a state of disaster is declared in terms of the legislation, which is the Disaster Management Act, a state of emergency is declared in terms of Section 37(1) of the Constitution itself. And you can actually see from the actual wording that it is a far more radical step. And I'll read it to you very quickly. And it says that a state of emergency may be declared only in terms of an act of Parliament and only when A, the life of the nation is threatened by war, invasion, general insurrection, disorder, natural disaster, or other public emergency, and B, the declaration is necessary to restore peace and order. So the conventional legal wisdom right now is that it's a last. What's the word? But it's because it's so radical. It's the last thing you want to do, which is why, and it's unlikely that a court of law would find it constitutional to have declared a state of an emergency in the circumstances we find ourselves in now. Nevertheless, Section 37(2) of the Constitution states that in the state of emergency, it can only be declared for a period of no more than 21 days, but the National Assembly may extend that period, first time around by a simple majority of 50% plus 1, and if they want to extend it for a further period, then they need a 60% majority in the National Assembly. During a state of emergency, most of the rights in the Bill of Rights can be watered down by legislation, but only to the extent necessary to combat the emergency. So now that we understand what a state of disaster is, and we understand what a state of emergency is, there's a third principle that's very important to understand, and that is that rights can already be limited under the law of general application. And what that means is that some rights can be limited in favor of other rights as long as that limitation is proportionate. So I'll get back into the exact test or requirements of that in a bit. But for now, suffice it to say, by limitation, I mean the regulations passed to regulation to the limitations to the regulations passed to deal with the emergency. An example for this would be the 21-day lockdown, and the question there would be, well, is a 21-day lockdown of the entire nation a proportionate response to the aim of stopping the spread of corona? And that question would be answered by a variety of factors, including the lifespan, nature, transmission of the virus, and what measures are sought to be what other measures are sought to be taken in the enforcement of the lockdown. Guys, I know I'm speaking very fast, so if there's anything you miss, please feel free to slow me down. I'm just cognizant of our time constraints, as Papama said. Let me drink some water. So let's talk about the regulations. Recently, Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma published lockdown regulations to deal with COVID-19. Some of the regulations will apply specific to the duration of the national disaster. To the duration of the national disaster, and some of those regulations are limited to level 4 to operate during level 4 of the lockdown specifically. Unfortunately, the regulations are not a model of clarity, and this leaves them vulnerable to constitutional attack. It's important to understand that the regulations must comply with the principle of legality, which I'll explain later, and ministers must provide rational, fact-based, and policy justifications for the regulations that they pass. Quite apart from legal reasons, this is necessary because in a constitutional democracy, voters are entitled to hold their public office bearers accountable, and the legitimacy of government acts is necessary in order to get people to actually follow the laws and curb this, so that we can curb the spread of the virus. Further, where a regulation limits one of the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, the regulation will only be constitutionally valid if it is justifiable in terms of the limitations clause, as I alluded to earlier. Many of the lockdown regulations limit the rights in the Bill of Rights, the right to equality, dignity, freedom of movement, all of that. In terms of Section 36 of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the rights in the Bill of Rights may be limited, and I'll read it out for you, only in terms of law of general application to the extent that the limitation is reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom, taking into account all relevant factors, including A, the nature of the right, B, the importance of the purpose of the limitation, C, the nature and extent of the limitation, D, the relationship between the limitation and its purpose, and E, less restrictive means to achieve the purpose. So I find that a lot of the debates debates on public platforms surrounding the regulations appear to miss the point, in that it's not relevant whether or not any one or more regulation is good or bad in the context of a pandemic, but really what's important is the reasons for it, and whether or not it's actually a proper reason and there's a proper link between the act and actually curbing the spread of COVID-19. So we see examples of regulations such as, look at the ban on the sale of alcohol and cigarettes, the curfew between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m., the limitation on exercise between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. So my concern, and this is my view, is that a lot of these regulations, if they were to be tested in a court, would not actually be found to be would not pass constitutional muster. Because, for instance, look at the curfew rule. Is there an indication that is there an indication that there is more traffic between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m.? What is the actual reason for limiting people to be outside exercising between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m.? Is there a factual basis to establish that people are more likely to contract the coronavirus past 9 a.m.? And in my mind, the most obvious reasons for a lot of these for a lot of these regulations is that it makes it easier to police that people are actually following the regulations. And in my mind, there doesn't appear to be a much stronger reason than convenience for enforcing the regulations. And as far as I know, and as far as constitutional law precedent goes, convenience can never outweigh the enjoyment of a right in the Constitution. So they're going to have to find a much better reason, should they be asked, as to why certain regulations are actually being passed. The last thing I want to touch on, which I find is probably the most interesting for you guys, and also the greatest cause for concern, is that there appears to be a demonstration by certain parts of the ministry of a lack of respect for the rule of law. And I'll give you examples of this. For example, let's look at the regulation that banned cooked food, hot cooked food. I don't know if you guys knew about that. Stores and grocery stores were not allowed to sell cooked food. Quite apart from any factual basis establishing that people were more likely to get corona in those circumstances, what happened in that case, as far as I was following, is that at some stage, Minister Patel insisted that the sale of hot food was prohibited. And then the CIPC actually took that even further and tweeted in a tweet that was later deleted that, well, this actually even included frozen food, and that is food, I think that means food that was cooked and then was frozen. And at the time, no such regulation actually existed, and it was only later that the government amended regulations to actually say that. Another example is, if we take this further, is that we find that the defense force as well as the police have been extremely heavy-handed in enforcing the lockdown regulations, and it seems to have been done with either explicit or complicit permission from the ministry. For example, let's say I think a week or so ago, I looked at the stats, and there was a report, a news report that was saying over 10,000 people in KZN alone had been arrested for violating some or other regulation, which is actually an astonishing number. And at some point, the Minister Bekele made statements which encouraged law enforcement to barge into shebeens that were still selling alcohol illegally, as well as to destroy infrastructure, which I think was one of the more problematic events, statements made in the ministry over the course of this lockdown, because there is no actual empowering legislation or regulations that gives either the National Defense Force or the SAPS the right to, yes, they can confiscate alcohol, but they can't actually destroy any infrastructure, whether it's involved in the illegal sale of alcohol or not. We have growing numbers of complaints to IPID, which is basically an organization that polices the police. And as far as I saw, there was a report in the media saying that a government representative had noted all of this and said, well, we're busy fighting corona at the moment, we'll deal with that sort of thing later, not realizing, not appreciating that keeping maintaining the integrity of our constitutional rights in a time of a pandemic is actually part and parcel of fighting the pandemic itself. So it's really concerning, because in circumstances where ministers encourage or complicit in allowing law enforcement to flout the rule of law and to use any means that they deem necessary to actually get people to fall in line with the regulations, then this means that the army and the police will be allowed, for as long as they're allowed to harass and assault and murder people, the less likely you're going to have public buy-in. And if you don't have public buy-in, people are not going to follow the regulations. And if they don't do that, it makes nonsense of the whole thing, and it actually doesn't curb the spread of the virus. So that's me. That's me. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Wela. Thank you for also being mindful of the time. I'm going to shoot right ahead to the one question that I see that's sticking out at the moment. and it's coming from Salman, our chairperson at Nelson Mandela Bay branch. He says, I'm interested to know the constitutional mandate of the NCC. We understand the regulations find their mandate to the disaster management or from the Disaster Management Act. But where does the NCC find its mandate? I think I just want to make sure that that's the only question that I have here. Yeah, okay. Let's do that, Wella, because I think we must hurry and move on to the next speaker. As I've mentioned before, the sessions are recorded so that this iterative process of feeding back the policy can also refer back to some of the discussion here. So fire away.
Okay. Sure, no problem. Can you just elaborate? What do you by NCC? Can you just confirm what you mean?
Okay, I need someone.
To?
Yeah, I need someone to what the acronym NCC, National Constitutional Court.
National Command Council.
Oh, National
Command Council.
There we go. Makes sense. Okay. Can you hear that?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
I'm reluctant to actually speak before actually reading up some more on that. I don't want to make any inaccurate statement as regards to the constitutional mandate itself. So I can commit to actually getting back to you on that question.
Okay. Thanks, Wella. And I think that,
sure.
Yeah, part of the interesting thing is that the Command Council is it's a kind of an on-the-go strategy that gets formed. It's like a committee that gets formed. So it's quite interesting, really, how regulations apply to that. Yeah, okay, so please mute your mic and please be in the audience. Maybe some of the questions will come and haunt you again. Thank you again. Okay, so I'm going to shoot straight to the next guest that we have here. Let's see if we can welcome this gentle sir. Mr. Skenjan, got a quick biography of Mr. Skenjana here. I'm going to be very brief in my biography. Mr. Skenjana is the chief economist at Business. He is the lead of the economic and market research and leadership team. He has 11 years industry experience. Prior to joining IQ Business, he founded and managed an economic research and strategy advisory company with notable clients like World Bank, Youth Employment Service, APSA, FNB, PIC. So I'm going to go into your illustrious qualifications for the benefit of time. And I'm just going to say thank you very much for availing yourself. Sifiso and I engage on so many levels on questions around how the economy enables or creates an enabling environment for young people in South Africa. So I don't want to be prescriptive about what he's going to talk to. I'm going to hand over to the floor to him right away. Thank you.
Just a quick question. What time am I working with us?
Can I shoot you down to 15 for starting?
That's fine.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
You're perfect, man. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Good evening to everyone and evening to the participants in the webinar. And thank you, Pubs, for the very brief introduction. It's always better when it's brief. You know, and when we contextualize, I guess, the youth problem in the country, it's a number of folds. There's the typical question around the entrepreneurship question. There's an additional question around the access question, and I'll address that. And I think a broader question around information, if I can call it that. And so I think you know, we'll start with the information part, and really this is around building context. I think often we want to depart to solutions without having had a thorough understanding of the context that informs the challenges that face us. So, you know, and of course, I think I won't get into the broad I guess, economic impact of COVID, etc. But I think we're going to contextualize the conversation broadly to youth outcomes, and hopefully then it'll touch on some of the implications from what we're seeing from the COVID point of view. But just quickly at a high level, I did some assessment over the weekend, and our GDP, 60% of our GDP is attributable to household expenditure. And when we look at that in a particular context with the various stages of lockdown, stage 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the economy was marginally active at stage 5, and so there was about a 30% activity level. And at stage 4, it goes up to about 50. At stage 3, it'll probably go to about 70. And at current levels, if the stage 5 lockdown was to remain pervasive, we would see an economic knock of about 42% of GDP, and that's quite a big impact on GDP, and that's primarily, of course, on the fact that you'd have lower spending from household expenditure, and as I said, household expenditure accounts for 60% of GDP. And we saw the numbers coming out from the Reserve Bank and National Treasury, and that they expect on the top end the impact to GDP to be an economic decline of about 16.1%. And so I think if you had to model the stages, let's say if we move from stage 5, 4, 3, 2 over a 4-month period, we'd probably see an average of about 25% implication on GDP. And when you contextualize that then to the conversation around the potential 7 million jobs lost, that looks a little bit more reflective. And so I think where I'm going with it as a starting point is that the impact on the economy is certainly not going to be small. And when it's not small, we've already seen unemployment numbers, skyrocketing over the last 10 years. The official definition of unemployment, we see it at 29.1. The extended definition, we see it about 38%. And when we look at Black people specifically, the number goes to about 48%. And so that's quite, a shocking number in terms of 1 in 2 Black people are without a job in the South African context. And when we've spoken then about the labor issue, and again, it's in the contextualization, saying the number of things that have been relevant and irrelevant in the context of the labor question. Many people have said, if the country grows and then the labor will follow. And then we saw from 2008 to date that we've had jobless growth. And what that means is that you saw economic growth, but there was a decline in the number of jobs in the economy. And so that's the first myth that's been debunked, is that you can have jobless growth, and therefore economic growth does not necessarily need to be followed by job accretion in the economy. And that's one of the things. The second thing, of course, is the whole question around unions, whether or not they're sufficiently protective for workers, or whether or not they're problematic for workers. I think the jury is still out. We can have a very interesting conversation about the history of unions in a South African context. And from 2005, we saw the World Bank talking about restrictive labor laws in South Africa, and they, 10 years later, they made a bit of a U-turn, and they came back and said, actually, labor laws in South African context specifically are necessary for the preservation of, or at least for the lowering of the extent of inequality in the economy. And we know that 70% of the inequality we see in the economy is a function of wage inequality. And so given the fact that on average, Black people earn 18% less than white people, and on average, men earn 28% more than women, there's certainly a lot of inequality that is embedded in our labor structure. And so unions are actually a necessary evil in the context of that, to try and limit the extent to which that inequality can accelerate. We've seen it widening over the last 10 years as well. And then the more interesting question from a labor point of view is and very specific, I think it's quite particular to the youth problem, is the matching of supply and demand of labor in the economy. I've always said that the South African economy creates jobs for the labor force it wishes it had, and not currently for the labor force it actually has. And that's, premised on the fact that if you just see which sectors have been growing, it's been finance sector, for example. They now contribute about 21% of GDP. And that sector is usually a sector that attracts, mostly skilled labor. Yet when you look at our labor force, 76.4% of our labor force is either unskilled or semi-skilled. The number gets a bit worse when you look at how many people, the skills profile of those who are unemployed, and that's 91% of those who are unemployed have a matric or less. And therefore, it means that you've got to create an economic context that can absorb those people, before you kind of celebrate a futuristic economy that is service-led. We often talk about the progress of growth of any economy is that it has to start in an agrarian format, and that means you've got to have your primary sectors being the core drivers of growth. And then from agrarian it industrializes, and then from industrial process it goes into a services-led economy. And so I think we've skipped a couple of growth phases as an economy, and now we find ourselves in a labor quagmire. And so there's the question then around the mismatch between demand and supply of labor in the economy. And I made the example of Germany being an interesting economy for us to observe. And what they did, so Germany, Jemba, we laugh a lot about TVET colleges in South Africa and the kind of, the quality of student that comes out of there. Half of the German population actually followed a TVET college type of a structure, and so it's this vocational, quasi-academic route. And the interesting thing, and they went through a very similar process to South Africa, where they had big bulk of their labor force which was unskilled and semi-skilled. And what you see right now is that education portfolio for that specifically lives in the economic cluster as a starting point. And so you align your educational imperatives and your educational outcomes to your economic strategy and economic growth plan. And more importantly is that the curriculum is designed in partnership with private sector. And so what it means is that corporates can future-proof for the jobs that they're going to need. And as a result, they've got about a 66% absorption rate of the people who go through that vocational training route. And so there's certainly then an opportunity for us as an economy to look at how do we bring private sector back into the conversation. And this is a whole thing around social compacting in a new economy. We certainly have to look and explore the economy in a way in which we socially compact into growth. There's no other way. Government is not going to lead us into growth alone, and private sector won't do that either. And so we had this labor mismatch from a demand and a supply perspective, and that's all the. There's plenty other contexts that we can bring into the story of the labor challenge in South Africa, but I think it starts to contextualize the labor problem in a South African context. Over and above that, then we keep talking about skills and, kind of we've got to do skills development and all of that stuff. But the challenge again is that when you look at unemployment numbers from Stats SA, or you look at any labor report, will it inform you what kind of skills program you need to put in place? And chances are it won't, because we haven't located the labor and sufficiently segmented the labor to know what part of the labor force needs what kind of intervention from a skills development point of view. And so there's a lot that we think we've made a lot of mistakes in terms of how we've looked at the labor in our South African context. And as a result, it becomes incredibly problematic for then creating a conducive environment for the absorption of youth in the context of labor participation in the economy. And as a result, youth are, experience higher levels of unemployment in this current economy across all qualification levels. And so it's not just unqualified youth that are struggling with unemployment. Even those with degrees have a relatively higher level of unemployment compared to the other age groups. And so, so the labor absorption issue in the context of our youth is certainly a problem. And some of the programs that we are seeing are certainly not solving that problem right now, but hopefully we can start moving towards a conducive space where that problem can be solved. There is a research report that we recently published that aims, I think, to start solving some of those problems. We bucket our labor force into labor clusters that start to contextualize those labor participants into clusters that would enable us to actually locate them, so that whatever intervention that we work on and we aspire towards can actually be targeted and have the right level of efficacy that we envisage. And so over and above that, then there's a whole lot of other issues of, access, and that's access to funding and access to skills development from a youth point of view. And again, there's lots of conversation that we can have there. But I think particularly pertaining to the youth entrepreneurial journey, South Africa is a unique entrepreneurial context, in the sense that it seems like when things don't work out for you, then your opportunity is to go start something or build your own company. And I don't think that's the right base to motivate entrepreneurial endeavor in the South African context, or in any context. And as a result, we've tended to find that a lot of the entrepreneurs in our economic context are agents. In essence, they buy somewhere and sell somewhere. They're not building the productive capacity in the economy. And so it also explains then why we have 3.2 million registered companies at CIPC. We had only 814,000 of those companies who were assessed for tax, and only 200,000 of those companies actually paid any tax, and 57% of the tax that was collected for companies came from 380 companies. And so you're looking at, and it's telling you the story of the level of profitability in the small and medium enterprise context in South Africa. And that's primarily because we're not building productive capacity. We're not building manufacturing capacity in the economy. Manufacturing used to contribute 28% to GDP in 1996, and now contributes 11% GDP in today's context. And so in a corona impacted economy now, we've got an opportunity to look at how do we do that. So we've seen, for example, the in-sources of medical goods and medical equipment, and so now that must be manufactured in a local context. That's progressive. But over and above that, I made the example the other day that, we've been crying about the fact that we can't consume our beverages and smoke our cigarettes. But it's certainly an opportunity, even from a policy-making point of view, to look at how do we pivot in an impacted economy. The Nokia CEO said something very interesting. He said, we didn't do anything wrong, but we lost. And so it means that the market conditions are always going to change, but businesses have to learn how to pivot. And so even with the context, for example, of inability to sell liquor, I made the example that if government called the top 4 bread makers in the country, so 70% of the supply of bread in the economy comes from 4 producers: Pioneer, which makes Sesco bread, and it's Tiger Brands, and I've forgotten the other 2. If government, for example, came in and had a conversation with those guys around them opening a bakery there, Lokshini, and those bakeries would have off-take agreement from the guys who are selling beer, Lokshini, and you could make beer bread, for example. So South Africa consumes something like 2.27 million loaves of bread per day, and that's actually less than what we consumed 10 years ago. And that's a result of rising inequality and rising poverty levels in the economy. And so bread is the second most important staple in the economy. And that's, for example, one of the business opportunities that could build productive capacity in the South African context, beyond just responding to COVID, but now to start to look at how do we revive township economy. So these are some of the things that we can, we can start to look at as opportunities of pivoting in an impacted economy to continue to build resilience, but also over and above building resilience, ensuring that we are future-proofing the economy for future growth. And so I think that's kind of where I'll stop for now, Paps. And of course, I think the conversation can certainly go on forever. But as I said, I think there's certainly a context that we need to build around what's the youth challenge, particularly the employment challenge, and also how does that contextualize to the entrepreneurial problem in the South African context.
Thanks, Sufisone. Thank you very much for that. I am seeing questions that are coming in, and like before, I will take maybe 1 or 2 and then switch to the next speaker. I also realized that some of the questions take a while to germinate, so some people will only generate their ideas as we go along. But from Salman, okay, the first one is a request, I guess. Uma Muhendrina has requested that you kindly send us a link to the report that you've published. So yeah, the sooner you do that, we can even publish it here. And then the second question is from Salman, where he says, can we expect a sort of new deal that is youth focused? We've heard of the state intervention for a post-COVID economy, but little about youth. And then I think maybe this one is an interesting one. How do you both preserve human capital and the economy? And I think the other critical things, Fiso, just to think about what you've said, is that the structure of our economy that you say has sort of skipped stages, now finds itself in an era of precarity where informality in terms of employment is the order of the day. And sort of short-term contracts are the order of employment. Freelancing is the order of the day. So even those people who are either graduates or not, who are unemployed, the kinds of jobs that they will be looking for going forward are these short-term types of contracts, and what impact does that have? So I think even this question that Tasneem is asking about, how do you preserve human capital and the economy, I'd like you to also touch on that in your response, because it's quite an interesting tension.
Let me just check. Okay. Yeah, so two very interesting questions. I think the first one, asking around a new youth deal, if we can call it that. One of the things that I was having a conversation, actually interesting enough, earlier on today, particularly on the back of the webinar we were listening to last night, where one of the guys was talking about how businesses, with better B standing must have better tax outcomes or tax incentives. And I said, we don't want to approach the youth problem, or we don't want to get to a place where we're approaching the problem as a tick box exercise and say, this is how many youth I've got in my business, and so I'm solving the youth problem, because it doesn't necessarily solve the youth problem. Because we found that, for example, people have found ways to get creative around compliance, and rather the youth problem being solved must be inadvertent to our economic strategy. So what I mean by that is that, one, if you take a view of a sector that is labor absorptive for young people. So the creative industry, for example, is home to about 80% of the people who work in the creative industry are younger than 35. 69% of people who work in tourism are younger than 35. It's something like 62% of people working in agriculture are younger than 35. And so again, the sectors that tend to have a velocity towards youth absorption. And so you've got to then think your economic strategy in a way that creates a conducive environment for the growth of those sectors. And so that way you are not necessarily creating this tick box exercise where businesses must comply to minimum youth employment standards, but rather create a conducive environment for the businesses that lend themselves to the absorption of young people to grow and to flourish. I'll make an example. We saw there's a Ghana fisheries example where the output from fisheries grew 5-fold in a period of 4 years, primarily because they utilized import and tax incentives to drive investment into the sector. And so sometimes it doesn't require you to have an actual capital outlay from your pocket, but an understanding the things that will make a sector tick, and that will result in an output growth from that particular sector. And so I think the youth agenda, or this new youth compact, should take a sector position, a sector view that will inadvertently lend itself to the absorption of the right kind of young people. And then you can run all your skills development programs to ensure that they align with the sector investment plan. And I think that then segues perfectly to the question around the human capital versus lives versus livelihoods question. There's actually a direct correlation between lives and livelihoods. And so when the economic outcomes worsen, it results in worse health outcomes and vice versa. When people have bad health outcomes, it results in negative economic outcomes. And so the question of lives and livelihoods is always got to be looked at on balance. And one of the things, for example, that came out from Minister Zwelimkhize was that extending the lockdown now from epidemiological studies shows that we're not going to achieve any more slowing down of the infection rate. And therefore, at this point in time, we won't achieve anything more besides strangling the economy. And so we need to start opening the economy. And so it's the kind of balance that you aspire towards that will inform that. But over and above that, there's been, we've got Paul Roma, who's last year's or 2018's Nobel winner for economics. And he founded the theory of, endogenous growth theory. And the key tenet of the endogenous growth theory was that long-term economic growth has got to be centered by an investment in human capital. Innovation won't take place without the investment and development of human capital. And so your human capital is actually your biggest strategy for your outperformance in a global economy. And I think that's probably one of the things South Africa has missed, is that we haven't understood that human capital is the right kind of thing, the right kind of asset that will enable us to compete effectively in a global environment. And so I think that's probably where we should be spending a lot more of our time thinking around how do we leverage our human capital to ensure that we can have a comparative advantage in the global marketplace.
Okay. Thank you, Sfiso. I see other questions trickling in. I'm going to move us along to the next speaker because I think we can recover some time if we stick to some of the time slots that we've allocated here, and then maybe we'll revisit some of these questions towards the end. Just to sort of segue from what Sfiso has been saying, so the idea of the session was that Wela kind of gives us the legal framework, and Sfiso gives us the kind of economic thinking that can shape our understanding of what is happening in South Africa. And then importantly, in the introduction of the session, I did mention that we are trying to make sure that the conversation that we have here is not insular, but starts to plug into a wider conversation that young people are having across the globe. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to shift to get an outsider's perspective and welcome Hassan. Hassan is actually originally from Nigeria and is currently living in the States, where he's currently a PhD student at the Department of Texas University. So he's interestingly exploring new frontiers of research into the practical application of building information modeling, blockchain technology, and virtual reality for improved project performance on construction projects. He is an architect and a co-founder of Chronos Studios and well-known for outstanding 3D visualization projects in Nigerian design and construction industry. Part of the reason why we invited Hassan also is that Hassan comes from that uncharted water of social entrepreneurship. So he's got a very interesting model that long before COVID and long before this buzz of 4IR has sort of been living out the realities of what it would look like to live in a digitized era. So Hassan, I'd like to hand over to you at this point.
Me?
Yeah, we can. Just keep speaking until we're certain that the connectivity is sorted. Are you? Yeah, we can just go ahead.
I guess you guys can hear me. So, yeah. Cool. So great to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you guys. It's a huge pleasure, and I've listened to all the conversations. Pretty interesting points raised there. Just give me 1 second. Let me turn on my brightness. I hope this is better. So I'm going to contribute in the sense from two angles specifically, and one is basically from an education point of view, and two would be from a business point of view. So from an education point of view, I'm a PhD student in Texas A&M, and Texas A&M currently has the largest student body in the United States, and that is quite huge. So, and one thing that I found amazing during this COVID-19 period was that the university moved from an in-person class instruction system to an online class instruction system in 7 days, and I think that's really incredible. The education rules are constantly changing, and I think I can attribute that milestone to the fact that there's some sort of already existing technology infrastructure that enabled all of that. Uh, I cannot say a lot for typical African countries, but I think that's what we need to really start looking at. Like now that the reality for education, across all spectrum is tending towards, going fully online. How does the government, how does education ministries collaborate with foreign bodies, international universities to start to learn how to deliver these experiences for their education system? So a lot of countries are jumping into, okay, everyone, going to a lockdown mode and things like that. But then we don't all have, all these countries do not have, similar infrastructure to even support anything that's going to come after it. So that's something that the government and the education ministries need to really, really start looking at if any country is going to pull out of this sudden, unforeseen circumstance, that things that we've not seen. So another way we can look at it, I'm not certain if there are educators on this webinar, but something I'll tell people to start looking out for is that the roles of an educator is changing. So, for example, when the COVID-19 situation hit, I was a studio professor, and as difficult as architecture is to teach, it has become even more difficult with an online instruction system. And halfway into the semester, we've had to restructure the learning experience and the entire course structure to accommodate these new learning systems, and that wasn't totally easy. So an educator's role is changing in the sense that you are not only teaching what you already know now, but you're also having to learn. You have to learn how to do something. You have to learn how to host a class on Zoom. You have to learn how to remotely mark up, your students' works. You have to learn how to, deliver a presentation without, boring everyone over a 3-hour long class. So, educators are not only teaching now, but they're also learning. And that is some kind of like huge challenge that a lot of us did not see coming, but, of course, we have to handle. And I'm going to also address this from an entrepreneur point of view, or from a youth point of view, in the sense that someone trying to get from so you just graduated in 2020 and you need to get into the industry. So trust me, right now there is a new level of expectation that is required of everyone. So, for example, I was in a conversation with someone about 2 months ago, and this guy is a top guy, one of the leading architecture companies in the world, and he said everything is changing. He said the things that are required of people nowadays are no longer skills, because skills can be taught. Like, they can teach you how to use Revit in 2 weeks and you become a pro. But what they cannot teach you are things like, communication, creativity, collaboration, empathy, emotional intelligence. And this is a new trend completely. And these soft skills are going to be challenged even more. So, one of the tips I'll give, young people is that stepping out of this zone now and going forward, you must, start to develop incredibly your communication skills, how to be creative on your own without being, pushed around, how to collaborate with people across, different zones, how to have empathy, and of course, emotional intelligence to know when someone is being disconnected or when, situations are not happening the way you're expecting. So now, because the physical interaction has been taken out, going forward, there is going to be a huge shift in how things are going to be done. Either in the teaching, the working environments, and sorry, forgive the noise. Working environments and education environment. So now, one huge challenge for entrepreneurs is how to move their goods to the digital platform. So their goods and services to the digital platform. So I'll say, just imagine that a young entrepreneur who's just like stepping out there in the industry now does not even have the chance to advertise or market their goods or services, physically to people. There are so many hurdles you have to jump or get around, and this spreads across even like being able to buy people's trust as a new company entirely, and that is one huge challenge that is gonna happen across board. For already established companies who are already leveraging like digital marketing strategies, it would be easier for them to pivot, like Papama said, like my company, we're already living in that age where everything is online. Even our work systems, our services, our goods, and everything is almost like 80% online. But then I can say the same for really small companies, and that is something that people need to start realizing, that this is reality. This is reality, and people are saying things are going to go back to normal. I can assure you, no, it's not. Nothing is going to go back to normal. Not with the kind of paradigm shifts that are going on right now. So that's just going to be my take from the education perspective. Educators have to learn now, and not just teach, but learn. And the government has to start to leverage on these international relationships. The education ministries have to start to leverage on these differences in education systems, to leverage and see how best all these differences can be brought together to further push the education mission of any country whatsoever. Right now, there's no winner, there's no loser. We're all in a new battlefield, and with time, things are going to start to play out. And from an entrepreneur point of view, having to leverage digital technologies to get to get ahead, get the businesses a step ahead of everyone else, and of course, how to from an individual point of view, how the youth can actually start to enhance their skills in terms of communication, creativity, collaboration, and emotional intelligence, and all of that. So much is at stake right now, and like I said, there's no winner, there's no loser. We're all on a level battleground, and we need to start running. Yeah.
Thank you, Hassan. I think what's interesting here is that the new workspace of the future. Please mute your mic in the meantime. The new workspace of the future will also have young people like your child there in the background. So we all have to adjust to this new way of doing things. But I think it's very critical for me to just really reflect, because I also had some connection challenges in terms of what you were saying, but I got a gist of you emphasizing the importance of these essential, what is often called soft skills, that the skills that can be taught, the physical skills, are not really where it's at in terms of where we are headed, but it's really teachers need to now transition into a space where they can empower their learners to understand the importance of empathy, emotional intelligence, and as tools for navigating complex environment, and then how critical it is that teachers themselves understand that education has now become a lifelong process and of development. Okay, so soon we will be welcoming Dr. Kanyile, but while waiting for her, we're going to use this time to steal some question time. Let's see who we can, because some of the questions were addressed. I think Swiso is still with us. I have not seen any questions coming in as far as Hassan's speech as yet, but Swiso is still with us. And maybe let me go back to some of the questions that were directed at him. This one is from Sven Christensen. Sven is a teacher and is a technical skills teacher based in Pretoria, and he says, if I'm understanding this question again, maybe you can resend, but it's saying, what of no one mentoring to grow and preserve economy? My understanding of that is, how do we, in this question of youth, how do we address the question of mentorship? Where is that conversation currently taking place in terms of policy and so on? What framework is there to ensure that it's almost like a conduiting exercise? You want to incubate and grow these businesses, but where is the mechanism to ensure that you are pairing them up with mentors to grow the economy? That talks to both formal and informal businesses and how they could be used in doing that. So Swiso, that one is directed at you. And I guess it's linked to then this question of how do we create sustainable economic growth for youth? So this one says during COVID, and I guess it's again touching on those things like some of the agility that we're starting to see now, where people are now migrating to being suppliers of masks and all these kinds of things. But really, how big can that really be in terms of sustaining youth? And also, I guess these relief packages as far as youth are concerned. How do we ensure that during this tough time we can survive the bumpy period? And then the other one is, I think this one's for you, Swiso, as well. I'd like you to please touch on how the relief bill is being funded. In particular, using the comparative of the American example, the 3 trillion versus what South Africa is doing in terms of a benchmarking point of view. So that would be interesting to get some insight on that. I don't know if Hassan has caught wind of that debate from the US side of things in terms of what Trump is doing in terms of relief packages for businesses. And then 75% of infections come from 6 metropolitan. If we close movement in these metros and half the battle is won, what happens to municipalities without infections? Are we allowing them to be active with one case reported? So that's sort of a governance question. So what I'm interested in, and that's applicable to a forum like this, is to what extent will BBE or BE, I guess, or affirmative action have a place in the digital economy? I think that's really crucial. And code data knows no color. So to what extent will transformation laws have a place in a digital, And then, Sven has clarified his question around business people opening up to one-on-one mentorship. And I think, Swiso, you can touch on that, maybe your experiences at YES and such programs. So, Swiso?
I'll try to get through them as quickly as possible. So I think, we certainly need to figure out a way of moving away from an economy of special people, right? And what I mean by that is it's only the special preserve who get the access to mentorship, for example, right? There's only so many hours in a day, and so if we think and talk mentorship in its current format, it's not a sustainable business model, just primarily by virtue of the fact that there's limited capacity embedded. It's the design aspect of it. And so, for me, with the kind of computing power that we're seeing now and all of those things, how can we use that, for example, to inform, some digital mentorship, and that really talks to around institutionalizing the imperative behind mentorship itself. It's not me sitting in front of a former CEO that needs to be sufficient for me to have learned something. I think sometimes, with all the things that I search for, regarding whether professional development or whatever, there's probably, if you could use, AI right now, you could aggregate a lot of the global news sources to better inform some of the questions I'm asking around starting a business, and so I think for me, that would be an interesting tech play right now. And so anyone who's interested here and who's a coder, maybe they could build that kind of a platform. And I think that would be an amazing platform. And I think for you to then augment that with the physical mentor would be an amazing solution. So I think that's probably where we ought to move towards, around how do we institutionalize the benefits or the process of mentoring and the things that come out of a normal mentoring process. And then there's a question around, the funding of the relief bill. So we heard, of course, that there's going to be a reallocation of the budget. 130 billion of that is going to come from a reallocation of the budget. There's 100 million that's coming from IMF and World Bank, and that's coming from what they call RCF. It's a rapid credit facility that is designed for dealing with emergency situations like a COVID issue. It doesn't come with structural adjustment programs, conditionality, and so it's rapid disbursement to help the economy deal with that particular issue. And so 100 billion is coming from that. The banks have partnered with government for that credit guarantee scheme, and that's in essence availing 200 billion with 6-month payment holiday for small businesses or for businesses in general. And the banks guarantee losses up to 12 billion, and only after 12 billion losses will government actually guarantee the outstanding losses. So the thinking there is that, let's help keep the businesses afloat, and if they stay afloat, and then no one has to assume all the losses, and if they don't stay afloat, banks take the first initial knock before government does, and so 200 billion is coming from that kind of arrangement. And then the smaller monies that are coming from an overcapitalized, well, not necessarily overcapitalized, but from UIF. It's complex, but they're overcapitalized in terms of how they match their liabilities. It's certainly not a conversation I'd entertain in this platform. And then there's a conversation around sustainable growth, and I think that's a really, really, really important question. And it talks to, we keep hearing, for example, about industrializing and black industrialist funds and all of those things, but what are you going to industrialize when you don't have the inputs? So South Africa's import intensity has been accelerating since 1996. And there's a lot of history behind that. One of the reasons is because we became a signatory to the World Trade Organization in 1991. And between 1991 and 1996, we then had to lower our tariffs because we had protectionist trade policy around that. And as soon as we lowered our tariffs, the likes of textiles, for example, took a big beating, primarily because we didn't have the scale to compete globally from a textiles point of view, and a whole lot of other sectors as well, which took quite a bit of a beating. And that's primarily because we didn't have productive capacity in the economy. And so when we talk industrializing and all of that stuff, we've got to reinvest in the primary sector in the economy. So with the resource endowment that we've got, again, everyone's spoken about beneficiation and all of that stuff, but that conversation can't get old. And so we've got to insource those supply chains. When we talk agriculture, we are the largest exporter of citrus in the world. We're the second largest exporter of macadamia nuts in the world. We're the #1 exporter of grapefruit in the world. And so why is the knowledge economy of the agricultural sector not in South Africa? And so there's a number of things that inform how you build a sustainable economy. And as I said earlier, when I spoke about Paul Romer and the endogenous growth theory and how human capital investment remains key and at the center of long-term sustainable economic growth. Well, it's a knowledge economy that also follows on the back of that. And so what kind of investment do you make in your knowledge economy? South Africa's investment in R&D is even below our own target of 1.5. So we target to invest 1.5% of our GDP into R&D. Yet I think last year invested about 0.8 or 0.9. The likes of, for example, I'll make Israel, right? Israel 10 years ago had an incredible drought, and now they are a water-abundant country. They didn't have water. And now they've got the most intense water desalination technology in the world. And so all they did was, to invest in research and development. And right now, they invest about 4.5% of their GDP in R&D. And so we have to absolutely be deliberate about investing in the knowledge economy. And so I think so it's the knowledge economy as well as a reinvestment in the primary sectors of the economy that can then inform the industrial policy strategy. Those are the things that will truly inform a sustainable economic growth path for the economy. South Africa doesn't have a middle class. It's got really, really, really poor people and sufficiently rich people. And that middle class will grow primarily because you are building an industrial base as well as you've got a strong hold in your primary input space. And then the last question around BEE, and it's this question around inclusive growth. And, it's a question that seems to have evaded a lot of policymakers as well as private sector participants, primarily because it was approached initially as a tick box exercise. And this is exactly what I was talking about earlier and how this can be counterproductive because people just look for ways in which they comply instead of looking at the spirit of that particular legislative framework. And so when we're thinking around inclusive growth, we've got to align, for example, incentive structures to things that will inform a more transformative economy, a more inclusive economy. But also, at the end of the day, you actually just got to crack the whip. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why we've got gender and race pay parity in the economy. So now all you would need to do is say in the next 3 years, any company that doesn't pay their people parity for an equal job, and then they're going to get fines. And then you build capacity to be able to chase up on those people. I mean, the capacity to chase up on companies complying on minimum wage right now is close to zero. And so all of that stuff, you don't talk about compliance of minimum wage when you haven't thought about how are you going to manage that compliance and how you're going to enforce the compliance. And so over and above, I think looking at positively engaging businesses to be absorptive in an inclusive manner, you've also just got to crack the whip for bad behavior. And I think that also applies to, for example, the level of industry concentration we see in South Africa. South Africa's got the highest Herfindahl indices in the world, and that's a measure of industry concentration. 1% of our exporters are attributable to 79% of the things we export over our borders. And therefore, of course, we're going to lose export competitiveness, but also it means that small businesses get nudged out every time they try to get into those sectors. And so we've got to look at our competition law and how that becomes, and how much teeth you give it to ensure that it chases after the businesses that are misbehaving, like the discounts, for example, who are increasing prices for masks, hand sanitizers, and all those things. And so I think there's a whole lot of things that have got to be put together.
Yeah, let's wrap it there. Thanks for that. As I said, this is an ongoing exercise. So the chats in the chat function as well are going to assist us in addressing some of the questions at a later stage. I don't want us to lose time. We are very privileged to also have a medical doctor, someone who's going to be speaking to us from the front line of COVID-19. I want to welcome Dr. for all of us a quick bio. So she's been dubbed the medical Wonder Woman by Startup Africa. At 28 years old, Dr. Nokanya is the epitome of what hard work, commitment, and passion can achieve. Having qualified as a medical doctor in 2015 after completing her Bachelor for Medicine, Bachelor for Surgery at University of Witwatersrand. She has broken the mold of the stereotypical doctor, boasting a following of more than 100,000 on Instagram. She uses social media to engage and educate and uplift her followers on issues medical. So I think for us, I'm not going to read the entirety of that biography, but I think for us, what's very important, we've just come off a discussion this past Saturday as the BMF in the Eastern Cape with Dr. Fundile Nyati, who, for instance, explained to us that the health budget in South Africa, 95% of the health budget in South Africa goes to physical health care, and only 5% goes to mental health care issues. And so what's interesting in the space that we find ourselves in, high levels of youth unemployment, depression and anxiety, and all these kinds of things, is it seems that already the health system had structural inequalities within it. And of course, now you then have COVID-19 kind of exploding that context and putting a lot more pressure and sort of sending that picture left, right, and center. I think part of the reason why we reached out to Dr. Kanyile is to kind of give us a sense of what it's like to be in the front line with all these rapid changes that are happening in South Africa under COVID, and her message to young people, and especially at a time when it's obvious that we are not taking this thing as seriously as we should. Dr. Kanyile, 15 minutes is yours.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Thank you so much. So as said, my name is Nogukanya Kanyile. I'm currently working at the Rahima Musa Mother and Child Hospital, which is a state government institution in Coronationville, which is in Gauteng. I'm really excited that the BMF has asked me to speak on this topic purely because I have no idea what's going on. I don't think anyone does. It's quite interesting because we've had so many established protocols and guidelines with regards to management of conditions, ways that we need to interact with patients and families that have been thrown out the window simply because of a pandemic that has taken over the world. It's also interesting to see, because usually in South Africa, we are so affected by so many conditions. And for the first time, I think we're actually seeing a condition that's affecting other parts more than us. That's great for a medical standpoint because we're having a lot more research coming out quite quickly. We're having a lot of information with regards to management protocols, ways to triage patients, ways to manage infectious diseases, protocols that we need to establish. So I think it's quite exciting also to see just how quickly the government responded to this pandemic with the lockdown. So a couple of talking points that were asked of me is, number one, what is happening on the front line? I think you need to know, firstly, it's chaos, but it's organized. There are new protocols coming out weekly. Sometimes even, the same protocol that happened on Monday doesn't fall into line on Thursday. So as a medical professional, having to constantly update myself is quite a challenge because I might be post-call when the new protocol comes out and now I have to learn about the new one, on and on. It's a bit stressful. Also knowing that I could potentially be infecting myself and then also passing it on to loved ones, especially now that level 4 has come out and the lockdown has been eased in a way. We have a shortage of equipment. We already have a shortage of equipment on a regular basis. So now the fact that we have to have masks, PPE, we have to have our faces, hair, clothing covered up by protective equipment, that we are in short supply of, having us use, for example, the same mask the whole day. When I was working in the neonatal department, we had 2 masks that we were allocated for a 5-day week. So you would alternate the masks. Wasn't very hygienic for us, but we didn't have the supplies. It's quite harrowing sometimes to have to think about the fact that if coronavirus spreads, we're going to have to triage patients, and to the point where babies who would ordinarily get a bed are now going to have to lose those beds because of COVID-19, simply because of people's behaviors, people's lack of information, people's misinformation, and also just disregard for what it is that we are trying to do by flattening the curve. And that moves me on to the second talking point, which was, are people really taking this situation seriously? And I don't think so. Simple practices like social distancing, which involve putting about 1.5 meters between you and the next person, are completely being thrown out the window. You wearing a mask and you wearing gloves does not protect you from social distancing measures. You still need to do that, simply because it minimizes the chance of you passing on the coronavirus to another individual and causing the disease COVID-19. It's also important to know that in the state sector, we don't have ventilator capacity. And while in the government sector, that may be present at the moment, especially because all of the trauma-related fatalities and incidences are going down. If coronavirus comes out, we're going to overwhelm the government sector, but also the private sector. And that I will get into more when I speak about the impact of NHI versus, private sector and how that discussion is going to be affected. But we don't have the capability at the current present to deal with an outbreak that's coming. And we're just we're already doing it. We're going to have to look at a baby who comes in with a bronchiolitis, who's now just having a severe infection and needs a ventilator, versus someone with coronavirus who is 10 years old and now actually needs the ventilator. We have to play those odds against each other. And unfortunately, the child with COVID will have to lose out because their prognosis is so poor. I, as a healthcare worker, am not looking forward to making those decisions, but I know and I'm preparing myself psychologically and in the state sector for something that's going to be a decision that I have to make. If we just look at also the socioeconomic impact of a repeat lockdown or a shutdown, if people don't take the measures seriously now, another virus could come along. Coronavirus could mutate and become more deadly. Small lockdowns are going to have to be initiated for longer periods, to the point where we might even have to shut down the country. Can we as a nation afford that when so many of our government officials are corrupt and they're not even doing the bare minimum for what we have to do for our patients at the moment? Can we afford for, I can't remember where I heard of, but there's an estimate that 7 million jobs in the formal sector may be lost. That's the formal sector. What about the informal sector? If domestic workers, gardeners, people who need day-to-day incomes are unable to get those incomes, we're going to see malnutrition. We're going to see infectious diseases go up, and that's going to further overwhelm the government sector, which we can't afford. As it stands, 85% of the population relies on that, with 50% of the budget going to government expenditure on health. The third talking point is, and it's close to my heart, is what is the impact on vulnerable children? So already we know children have weakened immune systems. And thankfully, evidence has shown that coronavirus doesn't affect children as severely as it affects older, more ill, patients. But the thing we need to remember is that spread is always the issue, because children stay together in groups and then they go off into their homes. They need to be taken care of at daycare centers. They don't have the luxury of self-isolating on their own. So if that one child gets COVID, evidence has shown and studies have shown that children can continually shed the virus in their stool for up to 28 days. Does that mean we have to isolate children for 28 days? Does that mean we have to close down schools, etc.? What is that impact going to be? And also, children who have congenital heart lesions or diseases that they've had from birth, they're already immunocompromised. So something like coronavirus is going to overwhelm their bodies, and we're going to see similar, and some of the doctors we were speaking to who were around during the time when HIV started becoming rife, is where we have no medicine, we have no ventilators, we have no capacity to deal with these children, and we're just going to have to watch and wait. And I personally don't want to do that as a young professional who's just got so much energy and drive for this country. There's also healthcare workers. With young children, we're already so careful. But with the increased risk of transmission, we are also then at an increased risk of getting that from a sick child and passing it on to a child who's sick with something else. So we are going to have to ramp up our measures. We're going to have to make sure that we get more PPE, which we can't get because there's no supplies. We're going to have to make sure that we work longer hours because our colleagues are falling ill. And that's also going to have an impact on the health system, because now we're unable to provide the service that people need from us. The service that people need has inevitably was going to change because of this introduction of this idea of the National Health Insurance Act. Now, for those who don't know, a brief summary is we make one big health insurance fund that private, public, any medical professional can draw from and provides a service based on the population that they serve, and they're allowed to charge per package. So they don't charge you for the theatre time, the anaesthetist, the various consumables for hip replacement. You get paid according to the entire package. For me, I think a couple of things are going to change. So how can we even have a health discussion around instituting this kind of a service when at the current moment we're having to pull resources from places like the IMF in order to just fund this coronavirus budget that we have to have for the rest of the country and the future going forward? Because does that mean that the NHI now gets placed on the back burner? Or does that mean we still use those funds, but now we have the IMF coming in and supplementing over that? What does it mean for salaries for young doctors who are now having to, give up their places for the Cuban doctors? And that's another contentious issue, because if we're bringing doctors from other parts of the country, you're telling us that the ones we have right now are not good enough to deal with the problem. Is that what you're saying to us? Are you saying that our young medical professionals who are actually on the floor, community service doctors who've just finished, who have all of this information and all of this training, which you've mandated that they do, are they not good enough to serve the population that you've allocated them to? Because you don't have fund for them, but you're able to bring people from Cuba who are going to sit in an office the whole day and make protocols why can't you use them in Cuba and ask them to send you those protocols? So there's a lot of tricky issues we have to deal with. At the same time, we need the expertise that the Cuban doctors are bringing, because we might not have them here. And I'm not saying that they are good or they are bad. I'm just saying, was the allocation of those funds necessary to do it that way? Could we not have allocated it to more nursing staff on the floor? Could we not have allocated to buying more ventilators, making space in terms of ventilator capacity, ICU capacity? And then also looking at distributions of doctors. There was a scary, document that I saw that said that the health minister, Dr. Zulu Mkhize, wanted to release a mandate that allows the Department of Health to move healthcare workers, be it nurses or doctors, to wherever they are necessary. And I don't know if that's the right thing to do. I think you still need to have a discussion with people, because where am I going to live? How am I going to get to work? Now will I have to use public transport, increasing the chance of my spreading coronavirus with the patients that I'm coming into contact with to people in general public who have to also go to work, etc. So it's very difficult, because how do we even have a discussion about privatizing healthcare or making healthcare one fund when we can't even get to the basics? We need to deal with the basics. If we don't have equipment, how can we even worry about making sure that this whole fund gets set up when we need to open up those health sectors? And the other thing is, mental health might be deprioritized, because if we bring everything into one pool, coronavirus is a medical problem, things like diabetes are medical problems, things like respiratory illnesses are medical problems. Where is people's mental health going to fall unless we make it a priority and we say, as part of the management of this patient with coronavirus who is going to be isolated for the next 14 days, they have symptoms of depression which are more likely to become exacerbated during this period of isolation. This is my management plan. We are not going to be able to address that on a large scale, because it's going to be deprioritized, because there's chaos around the panic around coronavirus. The last talking point that I was asked to speak about was just with regards to trauma and substance-related injuries that we're seeing that are on the decrease. And I've worked at Chris Hani Baragwanath Academic Hospital when I was an intern, and we had our trauma department. I can tell you now, it is quieter, and the ICUs are being freed up. Nursing staff, doctors are being freed up. Beds are being freed up for patients who actually need them. And we're able to ventilate medical patients who probably have had medical illnesses for a while and now have just suddenly complicated and need that ICU bed. They're able to allocate the resources to where they need to be. And because we're not having drunk driving, we're not having motor vehicle accidents, and we're not having fights, because people, I don't know why, they drink and then they become supermen and superheroes, and they can do anything and jump off buildings, etc. So we're seeing a lot more allocation of resources to where they need to be. It's becoming more fair, it's becoming more equitable, and we're actually able to see, well, if we take away the trauma, this is what happens. I definitely am for it. Having said that, I understand that in a society we're allowed free choice. People should be allowed to drink what they want, eat what they want, but we have to balance that with allowing people to be responsible and make appropriate decisions. And when you drink, that goes out the window. At a place like Chris Hani Baragwan at the academic hospital, we're going to have to ramp up the supply of doctors and nursing, but that also increases the amount of trauma that we can take on. So for me personally, this ban on alcohol and smoking has really helped us help the people that need it instead of the people that have caused their own traumas. But at the same time, I can't force people not to do something. It's just a call on South Africans to socially distance 1.5 meters between people, wash your hands for a minimum of 20 seconds, and please learn the WHO steps to hand washing. Use sanitizer if you're unable to wash your hands, and make sure at all costs that you stay at home, avoid unnecessary travel, and don't do things that are just going to get us into trouble with regards to coronavirus. The wave is coming. We are going to see numbers rise. We are going to see fatalities in hundreds of thousands if we don't be careful and follow the law. Thank you.
And turn on. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you so much. And just like that, you use social media to teach people about the medical profession. I see there's one question here, and I'd like you to rush quickly through it because we have to let the next speaker in. I think what's also important to emphasize here is that these sessions are part of an ongoing discussion that is going to influence youth policy. And we do encourage young people like yourselves to start putting out thought pieces into the public domain that can be inspired by these kinds of discussions and many others. I think we need more young voices starting to influence the national conversation on how we are reading these things. So, I mean, this one is quite direct. It says, how would a Taiwanese top nurse in South Africa now enter the South African system? I want to give you a quick 20-second window to answer that.
How would a Taiwanese top nurse enter the system? So that's very difficult because I'm not really well versed on the nursing sector, but you would need to apply to the various posting at whichever hospital or whichever district is available. And the Gauteng Department of Health, I know in this province has, but whichever province you want to apply for. And then you just send a message to ER with your CV, HR, with your CV, and they will get back to you accordingly and make sure that you're available for the interview. And yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I see another comment from Zimbali. It's a policy and an RF question. We will flag it and we will keep it for document writing. Dr. Kanyile, thank you for your time. It's just past 7:45, and this is the best time to welcome the next speaker. We like to end on a happy note, so we go through this kind of academic, legislative, high-end economics discussion, and then we kind of go into like the professional realm, and then we want to end on a typically South African story of entrepreneurship and what it means to be young people. One of the debates in the BMF around BMF pillars and on transformation is this theme of spatial transformation. And whenever we talk about entrepreneurship and other things, we talk about the township as an externality to our lived experience in the urban centers. So the next speaker, Mr. Nhlanhla Ndlovu, for me is always a delight to introduce. I don't need a script to tell Nhlanhla's story. He's really a change maker from the context of how we begin to have this debate around spatial transformation and redress in the township context of South Africa. He's the founder of Hustlenomics. Hustlenomics is a social enterprise that addresses the issue of backyarding in townships. As you will know, that there's often fires that break out in shack dwellings that are built in the backyards of people in the townships. What Nhlanhla and Hustlenomics have been doing is they go to each family and they appeal to them to transform their shack structure into a physically built bricks and mortar structure. And then they build in a kind of remuneration model that looks at funding and ensuring that the rentals that are collected pay out Nhlanhla and the business over a period of time, and kind of hand over the ownership to the property owners, thereby ensuring that there are safer structures that are fireproof and sound that people can come and live in townships. So without further ado, Nhlanhla, please, man, take the floor and take us through the story of Hustlenomics and also perhaps how a COVID-19 world has started to impact your journey as an entrepreneur.
Good evening to everyone. I don't know if you can hear me. Am I audible? Hi, Palmer? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Palmer? Oh, yeah, thanks. Just checking if you can hear me. So, greetings to everyone. My name is Nhlanhla, as Papa has already said. So, basically, I'm a social entrepreneur. I've been a social entrepreneur since 2015. I started my business way back in 2005. I was running it as an informal business. So I kind of like understand most of the challenges, like most of the people running informal businesses that they're actually going through. I basically registered my business formally in 2015, but my business started from my personal challenge where I've lived in a backyard shack, and I came up with a model addressing a problem that I actually understood that I've actually have lived. So I grew up in a forum house, living with 12 other relatives and siblings, having to share the same space. And you can only understand that there are many people who are living in those type of situations, and they can't even find a way to create that social distancing if you have to share a living space with 15 other siblings or 12 other siblings. So this actually pushed me to build my own shack in my own backyard to get a bit of private space. And we would actually rent out some of the shacks just so that we could actually earn an income from them. So this is how Hustlenomics came about, where we started identifying families who also have informal backyard shacks in the townships, and they basically cannot get access to traditional home financing. So what we do is we would replace those formal shacks with formal durable structures at no cost to the homeowners, and then we would share the rental income with them whilst handing over one unit every year until they get full ownership. But our core focus is basically upskilling people in those communities and giving them skills in brick manufacturing, and also training them to actually build the structures. So we basically upskill them and then employ them, whilst also using recycled construction waste to actually make the bricks for environmental impact. So this is a business that I initially started developing in 2015 until now, through support from various platforms, various programs that have been financing the development of the business model to get it to where it is today. So what initially happened, especially with the COVID-19, the impact that how it actually impacted us, that we found that because our business is not something that you can actually do online, we physically have to be there on site to build the structures addressing the same problem that people are actually going through. It's even worse when you find instances where we actually told to actually stay at home, and at the same time there are people who are actually destructing structures because people are invading land illegally. But at a time like this, I think they could have just like given them time to sort it out to go through this phase. So our biggest challenge right now is that we basically address people who are employed informally. So most of the people that are living in the shacks, you find it's people who are actually earning less. Either they work in the informal trading markets. So you find the ladies that are selling as vendors on the street sides, they're the ones mostly residing in these backyard shacks. So that's a core market that we're actually addressing, because this is the market that's basically being neglected. Most of the time, if you have to find accommodation, you would have to show some sort of like bank statement or a payslip. So most of the people that are not earning even less than the minimum wage, these are people that don't have a payslip and they basically work in the informal market. So these are the same people. When we replace the checks, we still make it sure that it's affordable for them to actually still reside in the same formal structure that we replace the checks with. So currently, with the pandemic going on, what has initially happened is that most of the people that are used to working on the side of streets as vendors, selling street vendors, these are the same people that cannot actually work during the pandemic. So as a business, we mostly rely on the rental income from the same informal traders. And if they're not trading, they basically cannot pay us rent. So our business has mainly been affected by that during this time frame. So what I like about our business is that it has actually evolved over time from 2015. Because initially when we started, it was basically to just replace informal checks. But over time, we figured that because it was a big problem, we would mostly have to train some of the people that have to replace the structures. So that's when we brought in the model of training people where when we started, we didn't have it in. And as it went on, we brought in the angle of actually using technology where we basically manufacture interlocking bricks, which we now manufacturing from recycled construction waste. And this cuts our building costs by up to 30%. And we're actually using 70% less mortar. As this went on, it has been evolving. So during the shutdown, we had to sit down and actually think, because obviously since our business can go online, we now have to figure out a model of how do we go ahead, because you'll find that before the shutdown, the government was basically identifying that small businesses would be the one who would be like uplifting the economy. They'll be creating more jobs. And then during the shutdown, you'll find that most of the small businesses couldn't even operate, which has been a challenge. That basically means after the shutdown, most of the small businesses will be out of business. So this now becomes a challenge. One of the very privileged few, because with us before the shutdown, we were basically getting support from a few organizations. Which one of the milestones that we recently came across is that we were part of the Shiva's venture finalists, and because of the shutdown, they've had to cancel the competition and basically distribute the prize money to all the finalists. So we're one of the lucky few people that are actually getting some grant funding during the shutdown, so that after the shutdown, we actually have some funds to move our business forward. But this is not something that every small business is likely to actually get access to. I have a few entrepreneurs that I know that are basically shutting down because of this. And these are businesses that have been in startup phase. We've been developing these businesses for past 5-6 years. And because of this lockdown, most of them have to shut down. And the sad part is that these are mostly like social entrepreneurs who are basically solving the same challenges that we're actually going through now. And now with them having to shut down, you find that it's going to take us back a very long way. So for us, this is how the shutdown and the pandemic has affected us. But we wanted to like few, and we still continue solving the problem of access to affordable housing. With our next phase going to be, because currently we're focusing on the more developed townships, urban communities where they already have houses and there's homeowners who own the houses. So we're basically solving the problem of backyard informal shacks. So these are families that are here to are there to actually get accommodation. They basically have access to electricity, which means there's less shack fires, and most of them have access to water because those houses already have the infrastructure to support that. So our next model was to go into the informal sector, informal human settlement, and come up with a model where we would address the problem of people living in those shacks. We basically came up with a model where we would put people together collectively, and they would actually raise the funds to cover most of the materials, and would give them the skills and train them in the brick manufacturing process, and also train them in the building process. So they would basically be able to build their own houses. So this is something that we can't do online. We basically have to be there physically building the houses. But we're basically trying to solve that same problem right now of people not having access to affordable housing. So that's basically Hustlenomics in a nutshell. I'll be able to take any questions that you actually have. But thank you for having me and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, man. Your timing is perfect. I got cut off briefly, but I was lucky to be able to catch on towards the end. There's an important comment from Mom H, and she's saying she's interested in the part of your business that teaches people how to make bricks. I guess Nhlanhla has tackled that, Mom H, where he's trying to explain that part of their strategy in that brick manufacturing is to see that brick manufacturing as an intervention towards the informal structures themselves, where the business may have started off as a backyarding solution. Now they want to move into those really where the hot fires take place in the informal settlements and use that as a counter strategy to galvanize those communities in the informal settlements to be skilled in building, and then to see the need to kind of impart that skilling onto the structures that they build so that hopefully they're fireproof and they're compliant and so on. And I think he's got the potential here to really influence our human settlements policy and to be one of the change makers in how the government begins to respond and think about this challenge of informal settlements in South Africa. So I've got 1 minute left before we end the session, and I just want to wrap up by first saying that as I said, it's important for us to always be mindful of the fact that we are engaging in a conversation that is shaping our policy writing process that we're going to feed into the draft National Youth Policy. And I'd like to highlight the 5 points that have been the policy proposals there. The first one is quality education, skills, and second chances. The second one is economic transformation, entrepreneurship, and job creation. The third one is healthcare and combating substance abuse. The fourth one is nation building and social cohesion. And the fifth one is effective and responsive youth development institutions. So you will find that the way we structure some of the speakers that we have here at these sessions of ours is to start talking directly to how this policy conversation shapes up. And I think on that note, because it is exactly 7 o'clock on the dot, I must say my big thank you to all the speakers who came out today to contribute to this. We will make the link available so that we can share it and have more people adding to the conversation and shaping it as it goes forward. Thank you to the audience who took time, their 2 hours and more, to be around here with us. And I must again apologize for the glitches that we experienced. We will try and communicate better that it is our intention to make sure that people start logging on half an hour before the start of the session so that we can troubleshoot and make sure that everyone gets going by 5 o'clock. Thank you to the BMF team that makes this all possible. This is the new model conversation that we're trying to frame for young people to really start being the change makers and problem solvers that South Africa needs. And so this is also a platform for everyone to meet people like Nhlanhla, to meet people like Sifiso, and hopefully have other conversations outside of this platform that can either feed this platform and any other process of making South Africa a lot better for young people. The challenges that young people are going to continue to face are going to be far greater. Young people are the ones who work in informal contracts. They're the ones who work in short-term employment. Precarity is an order of life that they're already used to. And so maybe it is about time they get empowered to take over and lead, because our elders might be struggling to let go of this thing of this permanence that we are used to, this job security that has been part of our history. So thank you very much. Thank you to the BMF. Thank you to Kulugazi and the technical team. The session turned out a whole lot better technically than we've experienced in the past. We are growing this. We are learning as we go. So the glitches will be an order of the day. Thank you for your patience in the audience. Thank you for your comments. I see someone has added Nhlanhla's link on the chat function, Umavo. So please, take it with you, and let's try and get more young people into the space. And thank you very much. Good night.